Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. Joe DiMaggio, Mario Cuomo, Nancy Pelosi, Fiorello LaGuardia, Al Capone, Dion DiMucci, Giuseppe Petrosino, Geraldine Ferraro, Frank Sinatra, and Rosie the Riveter. These are a few of the Italian-American and filmmaker John Maggio's and writer Maria Laurino's 4-hour documentary and book, The Italian-Americans. John's work appears regularly on both of PBS's premier series, Frontline and the American Experience. John's films have been honored with the National Emmy Award, Writers Guild Award, as well as multiple News and Documentary Emmy Award nominations. His work has premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and has screened at festivals around the world. John is currently writing and directing Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid for American Experience. Maria Laurino has written 2 other books, which are really extraordinarily worth reading. Were You Always Italian?, a national bestseller, and Old World Daughter, New World Mother, a real memoir of growing up Italian at a certain place at a certain time. Maria started as a journalist for the Village Voice. She later became the chief speechwriter to Mayor David Dinkins. She has written for The Times, Salon.com, and The Nation, and her essays have been widely anthologized. She currently teaches creative nonfiction at NYU. Folks, welcome to you both. Both as an American and Italian-American, I thank you. If they were 2 consummately engaging pieces of work, certainly to an Italian-American, Neapolitan and Sicilian who grew up in Queens in the 1950s and 60s. There were so many emotions in this. So let's start. You begin the documentary with the iconic scene from The Godfather. I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. And in a sense, it both strikes you as sort of being dissonant. Explain the use of this iconic stereotypic vision.
Well, it's funny because I made obviously a very conscious effort. I wanted to start with that moment because it's the most iconic moment. And in many ways, I feel that The Godfather has been a sort of de facto history of Italians in this country.
Yeah.
For most Americans, and for a lot of Italian Americans who don't really know their history. Happens to be an incredibly powerful piece of cinema, no matter what, no matter how you look at it. And I thought, let me challenge the viewer. Let me put it out there. Let me put out the quintessential Italian-American moment. And let people know that it's here, but I'm going to break it down, and I'm going to sort of move beyond the myth and the stereotypes and kind of look a little deeper and try to find the real history. But I wanted to grab you. I wanted it to be a little controversial. You know, in raising the money for this film in the Italian-American community, I ran up against a lot of opposition to me even dealing with the mafia. Every time I brought up the mafia, the conversation would stop. And so I felt even more emboldened to take it on and to, not to go trace the origins of the word, but how the media representation of that word affected Italian Americans.
Classic deconstruction.
Absolutely.
Maria, you grew up, and you always were Italian American. How did you first get involved with the project, doing this really complimentary and companion book? And what was your reaction to seeing the documentary for the first time? And you were in the documentary.
That's right. Well, that's really how my connection began. I was just one of the many people who John and his team were putting together to interview for the documentary. And I actually hadn't worked with John at all. I was working with one of his assistant producers, and then he came to the time where they were filming me and approached me then to see if I was interested in writing the companion book, which sounded quite wonderful.
And your piece, we'll get to it later on, your discussion of one of my 2 heroes, Mario Cuomo, was really quite moving, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Both of you, both in the writing of the book and in the documentary, you just referred to the power of myth over history. And there are certain almost archetypal stereotypes of Italians. One is the criminal, the mafia don. But there are other ones that are perhaps not as mythological, but they're there. Talk about these other stereotypes that you sort of recognize and deal with, and both of you.
No, of course. Well, one of the, in trying to tell the story of a people, too, just even getting beyond the myth and getting into the real history, I still needed a theme to try to sort of orient the film. And I seized upon the idea of family. Family is an Italian myth in many ways, too. It's been mythologized. In this country, you see it in Olive Garden commercials.
Oh, absolutely.
You see it in the dark specter of the crime family and all that
Yep.
stuff. So I thought an interesting way to sort of, again, deconstruct a lot of these ideas was to look at one of the big stereotypes, which is this idea of family, and where that notion comes from, and the insularity of family, and all the aspects of family, good and bad. So that was a little bit of a guiding principle, because you realize that Southern Italian notions of family were born and bred out of their experience in Southern Italy.
Sure.
And so they brought a lot of this insularity with them, this mistrust of government. I mean, they were really, they were not treated very well by the North when Italy was reunited.
Oppressed.
They were oppressed. There was starvation. There was famine. There was a lot of reasons, taxation, not to trust a centralized authority. So what do? They come to this country and they bring all of those notions with them. And for a while, it sort of holds them back from assimilating. So I would say that was one of the big sort of myths that we take on kind of early, and I think it's a really strong device from which to tell stories.
Now, just to talk about family, and we were talking offset. What was your family like? There's a picture of your family in one of the Buffalo newspapers going back. It was reprinted from, the 70s.
Yeah.
Talk about your family. What was it like? How did you live? Sort of a day in the life of John Maggio.
Well, it was very much a very Southern Italian experience. My grandparents lived not far away. Every Sunday I would, I'll give you a Sunday because that's probably the best way to describe it.
Perfect,
what
right?
We all relate to. We'd
gravy.
get up, my father would take all four boys, I had three older brothers, we'd go to church in the morning, then we'd go to my grandmother's house, and we'd have what she called sugu, which was sauce. We'd have a big huge pasta lunch. And my grandfather would sit there and pet his dog. He didn't speak a lot. All he would ever say was puppy dog. It's all ever English he seemed to know. And then we'd leave, we'd come home, and my mother, who was cooking sauce all day, at like 5 o'clock, we'd have sauce again. Only her sauce. And I could never tell her whose I liked better, my grandmother's or my mother's.
And you better not say.
Exactly. So, but my father was an artist, my mom was a homemaker, and that sort of artistic tradition was sort of throughout my family. It kind of imbued us all. We were all musicians, and that was very important to my parents. And that's what that I in a way to honor my family, I put that photo at the end because it was a story about a kind of becoming American. It was 3 generations of Italians in that one photograph. Yeah. And my grandfather was a musician, was in the Musicians Union, and my father followed suit. And then he wanted all of his kids to go and get a real liberal arts education, not a music education. So it was sort of a passing of the baton. But I was only 3 years old in that photo, but there was something about seeing all those generations in one.
Now, presumably that led you then to look a little bit back into your ancestry.
Absolutely.
Had you been really interested in any meaningful intellectual sense about it?
It's interesting. I do this series with Henry Louis Gates Jr. called Finding Your Roots on PBS. And so I'm always digging through people's roots and ancestry and going through documents. And I realized in the making of that, and Dr. Gates is always pushing me to learn more about my own ancestry. I didn't know much. We were told we were Sicilian, but I didn't know the town. I didn't have a narrative, And I think that it's important to place yourself in a narrative. And as I made this film, I dug a little deeper. I found some documents, some census records about my father's side of the family. And stories started to emerge that my parents just never talked about. My great-grandfather losing his leg working on the railroad, and the whole family coming from Sicily. So little bits of that. But you know what it is? It is a great experience, and I've been hearing this a lot now since the documentary has aired, is that people can now place themselves in a narrative, an immigration narrative they didn't know existed. They had vague ideas of it. And that was true for me, too.
But that wasn't true for you because you've, in both of your previous books talk directly about the Italian-American experience. And just the title of the first book, Were You Always... It's perfect. Talk about your family and what led you to write those and then get involved with this.
Sure. Well, the title, I should begin, Were You Always an Italian, was actually a question that former Governor Mario Cuomo had posed to me many years ago. And yeah, I was a journalist at the time at the Village Voice. I was writing a feature story on him. And I was trying to place him in an Italian-American cultural tradition. And I, had done all my homework reading about the East Harlemites and the Leonard Covello and Vito Marcantonio and Fiorello LaGuardia.
Yep.
And I'm asking him if any of these people influenced him. And they really didn't. The governor's heroes were much more ethereal, I think. They were much more, Thomas Aquinas, much more intellectual heroes, not the people, on the streets. And as I was asking him all of these questions, he looked at me and he said, "Were you always an Italian?" And I just thought the question was brilliant. It just hit me. It actually gave me little goosebumps because it occurred to me at that moment that we all have this issue as hyphenated Americans. Do we embrace the hyphen or do we not? Do we see ourselves as American or do we see ourselves as Italian American, Irish American, German American, African American? And I said to him with some guilt, I shook my head and I said, "No, I wasn't always an Italian." And he said, "Oh, I know all about ethnic self-hate." And at that point began to talk about, graduating tied for #1 in a law school class and not being able to get a job on Wall Street. So I used that question because that was exactly the issue I was dealing with growing up. How do you think about identity and ethnicity as a third-generation Italian-American, which I was? And I grew up in a very assimilated suburb. I grew up in a middle-class section of actually a very wealthy suburb, where when my...
Maplewood, yes. I
Short
know it
Hills
well.
was,
My
mother grew up
Short
in
Hills.
Maplewood.
Excuse me, they don't even let me in now.
But then my grandfather was a contractor, built his own apartment building in Maplewood. So we entered that very, upper middle class world in the working class way.
What was the demographics of where you lived? Was it Italian or was
Not
it?
at all.
Yeah.
No. Literally when my family moved in, people said, "Oh, an Italian family's moving into our block."
Ooh.
So it was that kind of feeling of shame that I sort of inherited and interpreted from a very young age and spent a good deal of my life trying to figure out those questions and deal with those issues of class and stereotype.
After you do The Godfather, you run through a really great series of movie clips that sort of articulate the evolving stereotype. And I think the second one that you show is, Tony Manero and Saturday Night Live. And that's another sort of stereotype, the Italian-American dimwit or less than fully there, particularly Joey, for example. And so you've got that. And then, again, I'm going to start fulminating. You've got the Guidos and the Angies, the mob wives, Jersey Shore stuff. Which of those annoys you the most?
I have to say, I'm less annoyed by it.
Go.
Because I recognize all of those people somewhere in my family. And, I find that when that's the only thing people know, that's what's annoying.
Okay.
And so I hopefully what we've done here through the book, through Maria's book and the film, it will add a little bit of a corrective because there are lots of people to celebrate, and I understand why they're celebrated. This conversation is going on in Italy as well. They have embraced the Neapolitan traditions that are a little outsized.
Sure.
Singing and all that stuff. They have become themselves reality figures, and Italians can't stand it. So it's not just here in America, and it's one of those things that I feel like we have to figure out a way to get our hands around it, but not let it blot out the real stories.
What I think is frustrating too is just how long those stereotypes have persisted. When you say Tony Manero also was a creation. That story started in New York Magazine, a writer supposedly writing about Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn.
Right.
And he admitted about a couple decades later that he made the story up, that he actually couldn't find the character he wanted. And he was an Irish-English music critic. So Tony Manero is a construction of an Irish-English music critic who wrote a story for New York Magazine, which was bought by Hollywood. But when I was thinking about
thank you. That was worth the interview.
But I was thinking about it recently because I have a son in high school, and I watch shows through him and things that I would have missed. And he has informed me that one of the cult classics of high school kids right now is Freaks and Geeks, Judd Apatow's show, which is an excellent show.
Right.
But what amazed me, it was a show that launched the career of James Franco and
Seth Rogen.
Seth Rogen, right. But what amazed me was that James Franco's character, who's very handsome, very sexy, and dumb as the day is long, is Italian-American. He has an Italian-American last name. Even Judd Apatow brings this up into the 21st century. And it's kind of amazing that, and that's what I think is so frustrating for Italian-Americans, Italian-American academics, Italian-American intellectuals. It's like, can we ever move beyond this? That because you have a vowel at the end of your name, it's
and it's true too, even just in filmmaking circles, especially documentary circles. It is, it has been, when I broached the idea with other filmmakers about making a film on Italian Americans, like, we can do it on the mafia. Like, what else could there possibly be?
Right.
And I just think
the only interviews I've ever done on Italian Americans have been with people that you had in your documentary, like Selwyn Rabb, etc.
Yeah. No, I know. Well, because it's pulp, and people are drawn to that.
I find myself every once in a while using the stereotype to my example. And I will tell one of my management styles is, calling Uncle Vinny in Jersey City. Now, I grew up, much of what you folks either write about or show in the documentary, I never experienced. They were, my relatives were cops and firemen, and there was none of that stuff was there.
Right.
It was a very different environment. So you introduced me to an Italian-American life that I didn't directly live. But there were some similarities, as I told you. Right. Our Lady of Mount Carmel on 115th Street, that was my Uncle Carmine and Aunt Millie's. That's where we went to church. And so there were real resonances that made me smile. What made you smile? I mean, you're making the documentary and you come across stuff. What made you smile and sticks in your mind?
It's, for me, the hardest part about these kinds of, any film that I make is the beginning and the end. And so there's an investment, a deep investment for me throughout the whole film, of course, all 4 hours. But in any film, it's like, how do I begin? And the ending and beginnings are often very much the same. And I really love the way this film begins with Rosetto, with this little town in Pennsylvania. And
that's exactly where I wanted to go. Talk about Rosetto.
Well, it was a story that I had come across just in the very beginnings of my research 7-8 years ago, and was drawn to it because I thought it was a very counterintuitive idea about family. This wasn't the crime family. This was this is where family actually protected an entire community, those family bonds. And I thought, what an interesting way to start, especially after just seeing the Godfather imagery that we see at the tease of the film. And so I decided to go there and investigate and see what it was all about.
Explain a little bit about the background, when they come, where they come from, and what they eat and what the doctors find when they go there.
Right. Well, what's interesting about it is when I first started reading about it, the story I saw were these headlines about how the Rosettans at this time in the 1960s were found to have, during a heart study, were found to have a much, much lower percentage of heart disease, which was the #1 killer in the country at that time.
I lived through this one.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And so I thought, it's the Mediterranean diet. It's something, that's what everybody thinks. It's the olive oil, whatever.
Right.
It turns out doctors found out that they were smoking, drinking.
Come on.
Above all, these were guys working in mines all day. They were not living necessarily healthy lives. So after a number of years of research, the doctors concluded that it was the strength of their families. It was living a sort of less stressful life than most Americans were living, than communities right next to them. And this was a group of people that had migrated from Rosetto, their town in southern Italy, around the turn of the century, had gotten to Pennsylvania, recreated essentially their existence that they had had in southern Italy.
Which a lot of Italians did, even on Baxter Street.
Right.
I mean, you see it constantly.
But they had the extra advantage of having farmland and their own vegetables.
Exactly.
Everything was fresh. They canned. You talk to people today when I was there, people who had lived through the study, and they said that everybody had a root cellar with their vegetables. And everybody felt that it didn't matter if they grew old because somebody was going to take care of them. And I'm going to let Maria tell a story which may be key to this whole thing, which is so Italian, which is one of the things that oddly protected them. Maria's got a great story.
Well, it's actually what made me smile, so it's a
Right.
perfect transition. Yeah, what made me smile about Rosetto was that I did love the story and I found it fascinating. But I particularly found fascinating how egalitarian the community was, and how they didn't want to have a fancy car or a bigger home than their other residents. And when I first came upon this material, I thought, wow, that's amazing. You know, I guess we have this in our blood, you know, and Italian Americans have been corrupted by the larger American society.
Absolutely. I'm buying the corruption.
But then what I realized and came across, an anthropologist at the same time that these cardiologists were doing the heart study was Italian, and she was spending time in Rosetto, and she talked about how they were all extremely influenced by the evil eye. And the reason,
Malocchio.
yeah, exactly. And they didn't want to be richer than someone else because they thought that they would catch this envy and this hatred, and then they would get the evil eye, and that would bring them down. So it's very interesting what the societal corrective was that kept this egalitarian. You know, you had this very medieval idea coming from southern Italy. The Neapolitans today believe very much in the evil eye.
My mother still feels. I've talked to her about this, and she just, you know, you never want anybody to tell you your baby was beautiful because that could bring bad luck.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's incredible. Again, another vestige that we brought over from the old.
Without question. I mean, I've experienced this as well. Go ahead.
So, you know, it's very interesting for me. I try, it actually goes back to the first question you asked about the Godfather line and about the myths, because I think there are two myths that Italian Americans have to deal with in confronting, honestly, their own ethnicity. One is this myth of the Godfather, which is just plagued us, unfortunately. But that line, I'm going to make you an offer you can't refuse, Puzo probably borrowed it from Balzac, and a version of that same line appears in Homer. So we've been having this myth-making idea for a very long time. But the other myth is this very romanticized myth of the Italian-American immigrant coming over and overcoming all of these hurdles, and, you know, really a kind of a hero who comes to this new country. And it was very heroic, and that's absolutely true. But they also brought with them a baggage of a very impoverished, in modern language we would say dysfunctional past. And both of those things are carried with us, and we have to deal with that and think about that.
The book is really 4 episodes, 4 parts. The family, you know, 1890 to 1910. So it's chronological, and the Becoming Americans. I would recommend that any of the viewers here, actually, you have to go, you have to get the book, and you have to see the documentary, because we can't even begin to give the texture and the flavor of it. In my notes, I have it broken down. DM learned much, and I have a whole list of things. What ticked me off, what's made me smile, and the book and film, how it resonated with me. I have to tell you, one of the things that made me smile was Antonin Scalia, whose politics and mine differ substantially. And then he talks, he said that it's a movie, The Godfather, it's a movie about Italians from Queens, and they're eating throughout the movie. And it was just perfect. And the way he said it, I gained a new respect for, the justice. It was really interesting.
And that the china matched his grandmother's, right?
That's right. And then in terms of the learned much, the role of Italians in the labor movement, and I think I did not know of the Lawrence strike and the immense influence of the Italians, but what gave me goosebumps and, gave me one of these teary eyes is the sending of the children and their reception at Grand Central Terminal. It was just mind-blowing. And then you've got the enemy aliens and Joe DiMaggio. Talk about the enemy aliens. It's just one of those things. Because my father had volunteered in the service, then the war broke out and re-enlisted and fought in France and Germany. And
yeah, a lot of people don't remember. A lot of people, obviously it was far overshadowed by what this country did to the Japanese,
right,
and interning them. But 600,000 Italians were considered enemy aliens because most of them were just sort of daunted by the citizenship process.
A lot of old people.
A lot of old people.
Illiterate.
Yeah, illiterate. And I was just talking to somebody off camera about that they realized that their grandmother had one of the cards. And I think what's interesting is that it was a shameful experience for them, and it's something that really hasn't ever been talked about. But there's a kind of almost, something I experienced was a sort of psychic wound by this whole thing that I think really affected other generations.
And you make that very clear. There's an element of both the documentary and the book where you feel this viscerally, and I don't know whether it was simply because I am an Italian American, but I think this goes well beyond Italian Americans. This tells us something about us. I mean, Americans. If you ask me what I am, I'm an American. I happen to be a third-generation Italian American, but I'm an American, and that identification is sometimes difficult for lots of folks. What do you see parallels between the Italian American experience, but there's not one experience, multiple experiences, and experiences today? What's the timelessness of this?
Well, for example, the enemy alien story. That was an overreaction by FDR. He took it away about a year later. But after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, he declares the next day that both German Americans and Italian Americans, unnaturalized citizens, are enemy aliens. The government overreached in its fear. And when I wrote that and that chapter and was reading about it, I couldn't help but think about the situation today in the Muslim community and how dangerous it is to think about a horrible incident and then overreact. Patriot Act,
Excellent.
All of these kinds of things that the government, you can understand the response, but you have to realize how careful we need to be in generalizing about a community.
Go ahead,
the same is true with the Mexican immigration experience. I mean, Italian migration mirrors what Mexicans are going through now. You come here, you make money, you send money back home.
The birds of passage, and then the white widows.
Exactly. I mean, we can't forget. President Obama in his immigration speech talked about this great line about how we can't forget we're all strangers in this country.
Yep.
And I think that this will hopefully reawaken people's notions to that, about how we treat our immigrants, because we were all immigrants at one point to this country, and we can't forget that.
Thank you. I thank you for the documentary. I thank you for the book, and I urge everyone to both see the documentary and read the book. They are both extraordinarily well done and very evocative, and we've barely touched the surface of it. So I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug.
My thanks to Maria Laurino and John Maggio for being on the show and for bringing us all closer to America's and Italians' cultural history here on CUNY TV. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.